All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to call this work session to order on FY 2021 Utilities Enterprise Budgets and Legislative Program. Let's go ahead and start with the roll call, please.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Allard.
She is excused.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
And Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
Thank you. So as usual, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Wilbur.
All right, good afternoon or good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Assembly. Thank you for your time today. We are going to do the second work session on the general government operating budget. We have a few departments to pick up, and then we will take a break, and then we will pick up the utility departments. And at the end, we're going to wrap back around and talk about the health department at the end. So our schedule is we'll start off with the central service departments, and our format will be the same. But before I begin, I want to let you know that we are working to get a response to the questions that you asked last Friday. We should have those this afternoon or early next week. We're waiting on a couple more responses. And just to remind folks that may be listening in, the presentation materials available on the Assembly's website. The previous presentations are available also on the Office of Management and Budget website. The budgets are also available online. So if you haven't had an opportunity to find those or that you have questions, please reach out to my office and we will get you what you need on the information that you might be looking for. And so with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here with the Chief Fiscal Officer's department. This is Alex's department here, and I'll summarize quickly. So Alex's office is really just him and administrative assistant that helps him sort of manage his office and those offices that report to him. A couple changes that, a lot of the information you see here will be similar. Obviously, the travel, we put that back in for the department. And then we, as I mentioned last week, and the way in which we build this budget, it's a continuation. If we have any one-time things that were taken out or added, we do make that adjustment. And then Mr. Slifka's case, that would be for travel. The other thing that we make an adjustment for is if they have any existing programs that we're going to make sure that we need to carry forward into 2021. Many of you know that we have been working on getting a stormwater utility stood up, and we borrowed some money to actually get that effort in place. And now we're in a place where we need to pay some debt service on that, the money that we borrowed in 2021. So that's what the purpose of the $43,000 is. And then on one-time expenses for 2021, the administration's proposing that we have, we're going to use a little bit of ML&P cash. This is not from the proceeds, but from the ML&P cash. That money will be deposited in the 2020 fund balance, but we're actually going to do the expenditure. One, in supporting of AEDC, and then Environmental Services Manager, which primarily housed out of Solid Waste Services, and then to support some lobbying efforts. And I believe this one here is lobbying in DC. And then, as I mentioned last week, Mr. Chairman, members of the Assembly, for those departments that might have execs or non-reps, we are proposing a flat. So in this particular case, while we did a continuation of the labor initially, when we look to 2021, we then make a reduction or of that continuation effort. In Mr. Slipka's case, it would be reduction in that continuation labor of $3,000. So I think Alex is inside just his office himself. It's pretty simple. Obviously, a lot of the departments that we're going to talk about next that report to him have a lot more tasks and complexities to them. So I will leave it at that. And if Mr. Slifka has anything he'd like to add, I'll ask him to chime in.
Thank you, Lance. I have nothing to add.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't have any questions or members of the Assembly, we can move on to the next department.
Yeah, I don't see any questions, but do want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Perez Verdia. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next department is the Finance Department. And the Finance Department's actually comprised, as many of you are might be aware, but those who might be listening in or looking at this material at a different time, the Finance Department is actually made up of 4 other major I guess, departments or supports inside finance. And that would be the controller's office. And obviously, many of you know the controller is responsible for all of our central accounting and our grants management in the controller's section. We also have property appraisal. And so property appraisal, many of Jack Adamus and the crew down there does assessing property values, and then helping us use that information when we set the mill rate. And then public finance and Mr. Ross Risbald. Obviously, Ross's team supports Alex by managing our investment income, making sure that we're getting the best return on our investments or changes that we might need to make in our debt by refinancing. And then obviously we use his team to help us with when we put bonds out on the street. The public finance team helps the city manage those efforts. And then in Treasury, obviously Dan Moore and his team, they really help us with our overall revenue management, our billings, our collections, things like that. So as a group, that's what makes up that $13 million and those 92 personnel. Roughly half of those individuals are in property appraisal, and then not quite half of them are in property appraisal. But inside that shop, there's really not a lot of changes collectively. However, there are some key changes that we are going to be proposing in the budget. The first one is in the property appraisal, the debt that we have to start paying on the money that we borrowed to actually update our property appraisal system, our CAMA system. So we are in a situation where we'll need to start paying the debt on that investment. And then any other changes they have here. As you recall from last week, we do make the adjustments for salaries and benefits for those departments, and depending on their bargaining unit, so we make that adjustment there. And again, that's anywhere, depending on the bargaining unit, could be from 0 to 1.2%. I also mentioned last week, as this should look similar, for overtime alignment, there is no additional increase in overtime for departments, but we had the salaries and the benefits all in sort of the salaries category. So we did true that up. And so the total amount of overtime is not changed. We're just cleaning up how much of it goes to salaries and how much of it goes to benefits. So, and then in public finance, they have some contractual increases for their revenue management. So we've included that additional obligation there for the $52,000. So, and then continuing on with some one-time requirements as we are transitioning and doing a cutover process from our old system to our old legacy system for property appraisal to CAMA. We have some one-time expenses for that cutover effort and some documentation and training. So we will be we've asked that those dollars be added back in to take care of that need. And then at the end, we have some changes that are not part of a continuation or one time. The executives and non-reps, this is the effect of keeping those salaries flat for 1 year. And then for property appraisal inside their CAMA project, they had some of their labor in support of the capital investment that was being paid for by the capital project that will need to transition into operating to keep that moving smoothly. And then they have a requirement for some ongoing Oracle license improvements, and you'll see this in a couple places. So overall, other than inside finance, other than the adjustments that we're making to property appraisal, a little bit to public finance, these are the changes that are related to general government services. They do not include any changes to the alcohol tax. And the reason I mention that is we do have, on the next slide, we do have an adjustment for Treasury as it relates to the alcohol tax. But before I get there, are there any questions from the Assembly on this department or this slide?
I don't see any, but do want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Dunbar. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, similar to the presentation, the slide that we showed for parks last week and the library, and then we will show for health later on today, we pulled a slide, created a slide that pulled information from Appendix R. And this is a summary of any positions or programs that might be supported with the alcohol tax starting next February. So we have a couple positions, and they are positions that are in Treasury. And so what these positions are already were supported with, to get them started with fund balance in 2020 to keep those positions moving. But we've also going to add some additional support for enforcement, and then some support for non-labor into 2021. So Dan's team is responsible, as many of you are aware, on the collection side and the management side and the enforcement side, not only the alcohol tax, but other taxes that we might have, marijuana, fuel, and the others. So if there are questions about this purpose or the intent, I'll ask Mr. Slifka or Mr. Moore to add to that.
I will defer to Dan Moore if he wants to add anything.
Mr. Moore?
I'm here. Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Just to let the Assembly know, we are on track with the go-live date for the alcohol tax. We expect to open up the registrations December 1st for all alcohol businesses, and we're actively working on a database right now. And we are going to be able to hire our first position in November, and hopefully our second position in December. And so, yeah, I just want to let you know that alcohol tax is we're definitely getting closer and closer, and I'd say we're on track at this point.
Great. Are there any questions from the members? All right, not seeing any. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the next few departments, we'll start off with the purchasing department. The purchasing department reports to the chief fiscal officer. So inside Ron Haddon's team, there's no changes in the total amount of positions, but I will note that in the purchasing department, when we were building the first quarter, we were in a situation where we needed to close a small gap, and as part of that, we had a one-time reduction to keep a position open. And so in 2021, we're proposing that position be added back in, and that would be a full year. We also had a half year for a deputy officer inside the purchasing department. We're going to fully fund that as proposed in this budget here. So bringing those positions that were held vacant last year to fund them next year. We do have some salary adjustments, and then again on the bottom, I will note that we're going to be taking a close look at the purchasing department. There's a strong possibility that we'll have a larger cash out than it's currently budgeted here. So we are aware of that. It's maybe something that we might address in as an S version, and if not, potentially as part of first quarter, but it's one of the things inside the purchasing department that we are aware of. And so Mr. Haddon made us aware of that. We just were not able to accommodate it here, but it's we're just going to try to figure out how to make that happen if the need is still relevant. So making the assembly aware of that we may see some changes here, either in S or in 1Q. So I think that's all I have for Mr. Haddon's team, unless Mr. Haddon has something he'd like to add.
I have nothing to add, Mr. Wilbur.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. Mr. Weddleton?
You know, I've got two. One is, what would a large cash out amount to? And the second is, you know, how is this department working? Or, you know, if there were more staff, would it get, speed things up at purchasing? And, you know, kind of what's the, you know, because I hear complaints, oh, it took forever to get through purchasing. And is that something that one or two more staff would make a big impact on? Thanks.
I'll answer the first one and let Ron answer the second one. So the number that we're looking at is probably going to be between probably 30 to 35,000. The need for more staff, I think I'll let Mr. Haddon jump in on that one.
More staff would always be appreciated, but we are cognizant of the fact that we will be losing some workload from ML&P. Remains to be seen how much of an impact that is really going to have. But at this point, I'm not proposing an increase in staff.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was answered through Mr. Weddleton's. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the Office of Information Technology, Miss Marshall's office here. So looks like a lot of movement going on. I'll try to highlight some of these here as well. Miss Marshall had some changes in one time, again, similar to Mr. Haddon. They had a couple positions they kept open for last year, and so we are going to, we're proposing to actually fund those and have Miss Marshall have the ability to fill those positions. She also had some savings from last year that we're going to propose that we add it back in here. We also know that inside the master lease interest, so when we buy technology, we do it through a loan process, and then that would include also most of SAP. And so this schedule is a reflective of, I think, primarily the reduction in the SAP support center services. I think that's the majority of this reduction in debt for IT as proposed by the department. Their salaries and their overtime, again, we continue to move those things forward. We did mention that we have a couple movements. I mentioned this last week that we have a couple movements of some services within general government, and one of them is a transition of payroll. The payroll division is currently in HR. Right now, Ms. Marshall's team is help managing the payroll, and primarily we have a lot of technology needs to make payroll even again more efficient and the work that needs done there. So Susie's team is making that happen with some leadership from Philippe Bryce. And so what we're going to do next year is we're going to move payroll over from HR to IT. There's also a little bit of, I think this is just a simplistic way to make some efficiencies in postage, and it's basically going to go from IT to the library. Last week you saw an increase of 32,000 to the library, so that's a net no change overall. But primary change you'll see a position count of payroll moving over, and then again the salaries for execs and non-reps. And then the last one is, I think Susie's been doing some work and been doing work for quite a while to make sure that we are getting the most efficiency out of our hosting platform. So there's going to be a reduction in our HEC hosting. Again, that's supportive primarily as part of SAP. And so with some changes there, we're also going to be being able to save some money in that arena as well. So that's about a $600,000 savings there. At the end of the day, the position count will, in our normal day-to-day business, outside payroll will be the same. And then the big number that you see on the bottom, depreciation, amortization, as you know, when we, all of the depreciation and amortization for our technology is housed inside Ms. Marshall's office. And so when we do the appropriation budget, you will see that we do not appropriate depreciation. So this number, this $10 million number should look familiar to you when you are looking at the ordinance and the AM support for general government. And if you have any questions on the overview, it does have a small capital program, but before I get there, I'm gonna ask Ms. Marshall if there's something key that I missed that you would like to inform the assembly of.
I just want to add a little bit that the 385,000 is the reduction in the interest that is reflective in 2021. And then as far as the HEC hosting, so what that is, SAP was originally implemented and hosted on the what they call SAP HANA Enterprise Cloud platform. And we have moved that so that it's no longer out there on their service, but in our internal, what we call on-prem server, on our on-prem hosting environment. So we are saving at least $626,000 for next year, reducing our budget. So overall, we were looking at about $1 million reduction in our IT budget. And then the other thing to kind of notice is that IT also reprographics, so the print shop reports to in the IT world department, so that every year they would always transfer like 32,000 from postage, and our reprographics is responsible for the mail for the city. So we were always moving budgets. We were like, let's just permanently move it to the right place. And that's why we removed some of our postage budget that we would just transfer every year. We were just permanently moving it from the reprographics budget to the library budget. So that helps. I'm here to, I don't have anything else to add. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I have a couple folks in the queue. Start with Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize if I missed it, but could you give me a little bit more information about what the two positions you would like to fill in 2021 are, and what the change of circumstance from last year to this year is? And similarly, why did we lose the contract savings of $169,000? Like, what was the change in circumstance there as well?
Oh, okay. Like, why was our budget reduced in the Q1 edit? We had.
No, I'm sorry. I want to clarify, I guess. I realize it was reduced, but the question is, because it was already reduced, why are we adding it back in? Was there a change of circumstance that requires us to move in a different direction from where we were at one quarter last year?
Got it. Lance, do you want to talk about your process before I add to this? Because
sure.
You have a process that.
Yeah, so what we did when we do a continuation budget, as I mentioned, if we have departments that have one-time reductions or one-time additions in the first quarter, we reverse those. We either add the money back in or we take those one-time expenses away. And in this particular case, in 1Q, we made a reduction of contract savings, and then we made a reduction of personnel. And so when we do our continuation budget, we move those dollars back in as we've done for both of these services. Does that answer your question, Assemblymember Zolotel?
It does, but other than just simply it being kind of how we do business, I guess from an operational aspect, I guess I would like to know, is it needed, and what is needed?
Yeah, the one of the positions was a position we were having a hard time filling. So that was a database administrator. And so we weren't filling it right away. So that is why it was removed from our budget. And the other one was an SAP position we were having a hard time filling as well. So so we temporarily said, okay, we're not going to try to fill these right now. And we hope to fill them next year. But they were positions we had posted, and then we weren't getting qualified people. So that was frustrating, but also like a reality. As far as one-time contract savings. So the SAP budget has to do contract. We have a budget to do contract hires for as needed services when we need expert services that we can't support internally. So that budget was reduced as well. So do we need it again? It's nice to have it back. And we could look at Q1 again and see if there's a way to reduce it, if that's what you're asking.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Well, thanks. Susie, you mentioned, and I think we've heard for some time now, that huge savings bringing the storage server into our fold instead of contracting it out. But, with the police body cams, we're being told, oh, this will be in the cloud, so it'll be cheaper, which is correct.
Huh. Well, it's an interesting situation. Our original agreement with the SAP hosting environment, it was a contract negotiated way before me, and it was very expensive, and it was for a whole bunch of servers that we weren't even using. So we've been trying to like decommission. It was like overbuilt out, and it's not. Maybe I could describe it better. It was actually data center hosting. It wasn't just software as a service. So you'd call it hosting as a service, which is a little different model than software as a service. Software as a service is where it's like you're getting Gmail, like you're not actually buying a server and storage. You're actually just saying, I want my email in the cloud on your service. And that's what the body cam software they're talking about, is putting that in the cloud environment. It's software as a service. Hardware, how we're going to store all the body cam data is still probably going to come back to us. We still haven't seen how all that's going to flush out if we have to build out, because there will be storage requirements. I haven't seen those contracts yet. So it's different. So it's infrastructure as a service versus software as a service. And I will just say that our original SAP contract for infrastructure as a service, the HEC contract, was really overly built. Like it was the assumption that we were going to have way more servers than we actually turned out needing. That answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, my question has to do with the SAP positions as well, and the efforts in the last year to move the maintenance functions of SAP in-house. And my original question was, are there any upcoming upgrades that could require additional specialized contract labor? And I think it's been answered. I think the answer is possibly there may be a need for some specialized contract labor, and that would be in that 169,498 line. Is that correct? Thanks.
Well, as far as the hosting event, so there's the system is so overly complicated, but there is a group. We have a really solid team of 3 people that are supporting the hosting environment. So the Basis is the name of the platform, So we have 3 people full-time that are supporting that, and we're feeling really solid about that expertise. We really lucked out and hired some great people. Will we need other services moving forward? Like, will we need an additional contractor to help us add a feature in the benefit department? Like when we change up benefit providers, we're going to need a new interface that's going to go from right now. Our third-party administrator we use, we have an interface built to communicate with them. So if we get a new, this is just an example, we go out to bid this year, we get a new third-party administrator, all of a sudden we're going to be like, oh my gosh, we need to build a new interface, and who's got that expertise? And that's what we would use, that specialized contract services to support those kind of events. So we are trying to scope all that out. We have a pretty good idea, but some of that stuff is kind of unknown until it happens.
Got it. Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm just wondering how many more years before we have our SAP completely depreciated out?
Through the chair, I think it's 20.
Through the chair, this is Alex. I think we're actually depreciating it over 15, not 20.
Okay.
And I think we're 2 years down the road, so I think we've got 13 left to go.
13 more years?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any further questions. Thank you.
All right, the next is IT does have a capital budget. So if you look inside the capital improvement budget and capital improvement program, you'll see some investments there for the Office of Information Technology. And I think in general, these are things that we'll see every year. The first one there is basically, helping replace laptops and desktops inside IT. And, I think their schedule is like 5 years on desktops and maybe 3 on laptops. And then they have a enterprise need for updating and keeping the infrastructure. So that's the second one. And then the next 2 are really sort of security related. Originally, I think the first one here, they were going to do this in 2020. They just due to capacity and timing and other forces, they didn't get a chance to get that one done. So we moved it to 2021. And then the last one is, continuing to replace and do some combining of their servers and their hardware and their storage. So that would be that fourth project. The color of the money, as it were, in the other column, we don't bond for computers. We don't get any state or federal dollars for those. So we put out either a lease or a loan program, and then so that's how we pay for those. It's financing primarily by loans, or if we have a situation where we can lease it if it's necessary, then that's where the other column comes into play for IT.
And I just want to add just a little bit is that our network security, so the second, third, and fourth items, we originally were going to, those were original 2020 spends, and I have spent a lot of time with my team to make sure we are spending all of our previous capital money. We've been, anyway, so we said, okay, we're not going to do these capital purchases this year because we found money in our old capital budgets. There's a little here, a little there, and we've really flushed those out. So we didn't spend that money this year. So it's in our budget for next year. But they are annual. They aren't always going to be the same annual amount, but they are. We have to do our life cycle management and keep on our security.
Thank you, Susie.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Thank you.
Right. Okay, moving on to human resources. So this is Cheryl Evans' department, and HR has had some I think, as I mentioned, the personnel change is probably the biggest change here. But let's kind of run through the changes themselves. We did have a one-time contribution workman's comp settlement. So workman's comp is identified. If we have a settlement, it's identified in the HR department. So that was a one-time reversal. That was a cost last year that we recovered for. It's not a cost that that will continue into 21. And then we made some changes in salaries, and then again the overtime. The next line shows the transfer of the payroll from HR to IT. And then the last sections here, the things that are unique to human resources. We do have a commitment to continue a PERS liability for those MLMP, previous MLMP employees that will continue. We estimate that that amount is going to be roughly $1.2 million when we go into 2021. If the number may change as we get more up-to-date information from benefits, but that was at a point in time. We'll make the adjustments to the salaries. And as I started off last week and remind the assembly, we do have 3 positions that we are proposing to add. One of them was in development services. The other one is in the HR department as a classification. Work on some backlog. For those of you who might not know what a classification individual does, but it's key to anybody that wants to make any changes to personnel. They have some support into the hiring process, but just any classification concerns or changes that we need to make. I think there may be 2 deep, 2 individuals, maybe 3 inside classification for the entire city, which would include the utilities. So a benefit to adding some capacity there. And then the other thing that we look at for departments is we have a vacancy factor. And so what a vacancy factor does is if an individuals have 10 employees in their department, for example, we apply a vacancy factor that makes an assumption based on previous history, probably 3 years of history looking back, how many of those positions are actually filled in a full year. So if an individual has 10 positions, we don't give them 100% budget for 10 positions because there will be, based on history, a point during the year which those positions aren't filled. And so we apply a vacancy factor. In HR's case, we did look back and their positions that they have available, they don't have very many vacancies. So when their positions are filled, they have to save this money elsewhere. So we are reducing their vacancy factor, which basically adds money to their budget to pay for all of those positions that we have filled. And so this is, if you have quite more questions about why we do that or when we do that, I'll be glad to follow up. But in HR's case, their vacancy factor was $150,000 and now it'll be 75. So they still have some there, but addition of a position and a reduction of their vacancy factor would add about 181,000 to the department's budget. So outside the changes in personnel, those are the highlights for HR. And I think, as many of you may know, I mean, Cheryl's team does a lot besides classification and employment. We're also in charge of all the labor negotiations and all of those activities as well, the hiring. And if there's a need for any disciplinary matters, they are engaged in that. So anyway, Cheryl, if I missed something, please add in.
Good morning, everybody. I was just going to maybe add on a little bit more to the classification position that we are requesting. In addition to what Lance said, the classification team is also, in addition to being responsible for position descriptions and job classifications and organizational structure things, they're also instrumental in keeping the SAP workflows operating correctly. And as you know, SAP is highly complex, and this group works with integrating the work processes as they relate to employees' roles. And so things that make our work flow, like time card approvals, shopping cart authority approvals, invoice approvals, a number of other managerial functions are managed in large measure by this team, making sure all of the wiring, if you will, is connected correctly by person or PCN in the back end of the system. And so it's that piece, in addition to the classification, that there's kind of a dueling demand for. And so that is where we're requesting an additional person to help us with the backlog in classification is sometimes, many times months, and often, I won't say often, in some rare occasions, years to get things pushed through. So I just wanted to give you a little bit more depth on their involvement in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
So you're losing your payroll people. What will be done better by moving payroll into IT?
I can take a stab at that. I think what we have found is as you all know, payroll is run through the SAP system, which again is a very complex system. And what we were finding was there were a lot of technological things that we found IT needed to be in closer concert, if you will, on a regular basis with some of the things that we were working with. And so the plan came into being earlier in 2020 that this move might not be a bad one to take. And I can let Susie or Lance fill in more if they would like.
I'll just add that I think a lot of the needs this year and I think Susie's team in working through the technology of the audits has been key. And I think, as Ms. Evans mentioned, there's a lot of intricacies inside the SAP portion of the technology portion of it that IT has a stronger understanding of than just an HR professional might. So for 21, we're going to propose to move them for next year.
I can follow up a little bit.
Go ahead.
So, you know, I just try to imagine what kind of issues come up with payroll. And so obviously just the basic day-to-day sounds like it's more of an IT issue, but, you know, if someone, you know, do they qualify for family medical leave, or, you know, what are their, you know, I guess correcting pay sheets, you know, were they overtime or not, and things like that, you know, that seems like an IT person wouldn't deal with. And I'm sure that anyone in HR would make a much longer list of things like that. I mean, how will those things be handled?
Through the chair. I will tell you that just because they're transitioning over to IT does not mean we are not working in very close concert on a regular basis. We lots of coordination efforts. Many times, you know, all of the leaves, all of the pay, and I won't say all, but I mean, if there's an issue, perhaps that is run through labor or whatever, we are not without our regular collaboration on any issues that may come up. And I guess I can let Susie or Lance maybe fill in a little bit more, but I don't feel that this separation is means that we are not or will not be working in close concert any longer.
I can, through the chair, this is Susie, 100% agree. We are definitely, and will continue to work closely, just like how we payroll has to work closely with finance as well. So those collaboration opportunities are still there. What we have kind of what we're eliminating by having the payroll join the SAP team is we're eliminating the technology conflicts. And there was, right when we started SAP, there were a lot of issues with payroll. And so to make sure that we were solving all those issues related to technology, was it technology, was it not, what is SAP fixed, is it not, is to work closer with that team. So that's why this is happening the way it is. But the team members haven't changed. They are still payroll and time experts. That they are not IT professionals. Does that answer that?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I don't see any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the municipal attorney's office. So in Ms. Vogel's shop, continuing on the same amount of personnel changes or personnel numbers, no changes in their personnel. Similar to many departments, there was some travel that we reduced, so we'll add that back into 21. And then we had some one-time expenses of a municipal attorney's time to the ML&P sale last year, so we moved those to ML&P for that one period. And so we were not using the attorney's budget to pay for those for a portion of the year. But that will, we need that attorney back in doing other tasks that are not ML&P related. And so we'll again make some salaries and adjustments overall to the municipal attorney's office. And then in Ms. Vogel's shop, she has some one-time changes for some file upgrades to go paperless, and then some electronic court docking. I think this is primarily related to the connection to the state's court system. Rather than making copies and moving things, there's an opportunity to do that more electronically, and then do some sharing of files and calendars that would allow them to be a little bit more efficient. So this is some one-time adjustments on the technology side that would be for the municipal attorney. And then obviously we're going to have some of the changes. Most of the municipal attorney's office is executives and non-representatives. I think all of the lawyers are executives, and then they have some non-rep folks in there. And so there will be a flat continuation in that place. And I think Ms. Vogel has expressed initially that this is something else the administration was looking at on whether or not this might be a place that we might have to look at into the immediate future because of the potentially some inequities there on how our attorneys are paid compared to their peers at locally at a state or even a federal level. So Ms. Vogel was concerned a little bit about that, and we heard that, so that's something we're keeping our eye on. And then the next part is, again, some ongoing services on the efficiency and modernization project that will continue as a maintenance. So I think with that, I think the last thing I'll mention is that when we have settlements and judgments that occur for the municipality, you will see those settlements and judgments costs in those departments from which the settlement is directed at or to, and not in the municipal attorney's office, even though this office is the one that helps us manage those and from a legal perspective. So I think with that, if Kate has something she'd like to add, I will turn it over to her.
So this is my first full budget cycle. I don't have much to add except to say that when I was working for the state, I remember that my counterpart, when he would go to the legislature, would say, the legal department saves you money by trying to eliminate liability when it happens. departments get good decisions in court. So that's my ordinary pitch. And in terms of other things to add on with regard to the updates that are being requested, they're really for prosecution and more than civil. That's where we've got a lot of technology that is weighing us down right now, and a lot of papers that are literally weighing us down. I don't think that this would get us all the way to paperless or do all of the work that we need for full modernization, but this would be a big step in the right direction.
Thank you. I have a couple folks in the queue. Mr. Weddleton.
Well, thanks. So, Lance, I'm glad you brought up the likelihood of increased pay. I was surprised to see that these salaries were flat because we had a pretty good presentation not too long ago that kind of showed the comparison with what we pay and the state does, and how we're getting a lot of turnover, people coming in and then leaving. Is it possible to give us and it seemed to me there was actually a number proposed, for pay. And if that's true, or if you can come up with something that would be reasonable to show what that would amount to were we to, increase the pay to a more competitive level.
Through the chair, Mr. Weddleton, we do have that number. I don't recall that number, but I will send it to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you. My request was the same as Mr. Weddleton's, just a little bit beyond the number in the analysis or the comparison. That would be great. Thanks.
Happy.
Thank you. All right. I don't see any further questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate. All right. The next department is Office of Management and Budget. No changes to ours other than the salaries and the cleanup and the overtime. Again, pretty much everybody, 4 of the 5 individuals, I think all of them were all non-reps, execs, so we will maintain flat for coming year. And we don't have any changes in our non-labor, just a continuation budget from this year to next. So. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I don't see anyone in the queue. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we have the mayor's office. The mayor's office, the revised budget for 2020 is a little bit more than $2 million with the 9 positions that they have. Like many, we made some adjustments to add back in travel and fuel, and then we made the salary adjustments that we had proposed there. And then, as you can see, most of the folks in the mayor's office are either execs or non-reps. And so there's pretty much a flat for the salaries inside the mayor's office. And then we have one addition. Administration is interested in making language access program a little bit more muni-wide. I think the initial request for this was closer to 100,000. But until the program and we get a little bit more of a plan together on how we're actually going to deploy it, administration was proposing that we start off with 25,000 to make that language access program go muni-wide. So other than that, as a reminder, when you look at the mayor's budget, about 690,000 of their 2 million is for community grants. And so they have a large portion of their budget is to outside the department itself. So I just want to remind the assembly and those who may be listening to that. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman, unless Mr. Bockenstead has something to add.
I don't have anything to add. Thanks, Lance.
Okay.
All right. I have a question from Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are all of the 9 positions currently filled?
I will verify, but I don't believe they are.
You are correct, Lance. There's one vacancy at this point in time.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Not seeing any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, so the next department, this is a new department proposed in the 21 budget, and this department was as a result of the passage of AO 2020-79S, where we are going to be creating an equity and justice department. And we're going to kind of formulate it in the organization similar to internal audit, in which, you know, really this position is as simply as I can explain it, and Mr. Bockenstead can add in. And I know many of the assembly members are more familiar with the department than I, but for others, you know, it's really to sort of look at how we can make any adjustments to equity issues that might be sort of negatively impacting our organization, our community, and our departments, to take a closer look at those and have someone focused on that particular purpose itself. And so the proposal is to have a chief equity officer that would be available to address those needs, and they will obviously be working closely with the Office of Equal Opportunity. So we have a little bit of non-labor in there. With that, that is my limited knowledge on the department itself, and if Mr. Bockenstead has more to add, or if assembly members have questions, we can follow up for sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Mr. Weddleton.
Well, thanks. You know, I'm surprised to see this as a department. I thought when we kind of funded this, we combined, you know, the equity officer with the DBE officer and the other, I'm sorry, I don't remember all the names, but we had like 2 or 3 other departments that dealt with somewhat similar issues in different directions. And I thought they were all combined into one department.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Weldon, I will verify. When we structured the budget, we took a look at the ordinance, and it does look like that the Office of Equal Opportunity has a link sort of under the Equity and Justice Department, but we were doing our best to illustrate what was passed in the ordinance, but we will take another look at it, and if we have it incorrectly presented or programmed, we'll make sure that we make that change. We were trying to follow what we thought was the intent implied in the ordinance. So, and we did make some adjustments to the organizational structure to show it that way. So we'll verify that. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I was just noting in the chat that I had a similar question as John. Perhaps I'm misremembering, but I thought the ordinance had created this office, and then the OEO and the chief equity officer were both under the newly created umbrella office, but I could be mistaken.
Through the chair, Mr. Dunbar, you are correct. There is reference to the OEO, which is currently under the municipal manager's office, but we'll make sure that we follow up with that and make sure that we're illustrating it properly.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. Thanks so much.
Okay, the next department is the Assembly's office. And so for the Assembly, we have basically the only reversal from one time is a little bit of travel that was reduced in 1Q. And so that was added back in. And then we make the regular adjustments for salaries and benefits inside the Assembly office. And then we also noted that in the overtime, we trued that up. We were made aware that there are requirements for CityView software contractual increases. So we added that in addition to the budget. We also know that the audit contract is going to go up next year. So we had that in there. As I recall, the Assembly office also had some potentially some net zero changes where they were making a reduction. Or we might be able to add some of the other things that are not reflected here in their request. So I think many of the requests we were able to accommodate either as a continuation or in that. I think the big things that the Assembly is apprised of is that there was a request for 11 part-time positions. I think the number is about 114,000. We're not able to include those in the proposed budget. And then the other one was the proposed funding for a runoff election following next April's regular election for about $140,000. The administration is aware of that one as well. You know, knowing how that regular election might turn out, there's always there's a need to do that in the first quarter. We'll certainly be needing to do that. I mean, that was where we ended up in this proposed budget. So, and I think with that, I will ask Ms. Jones or Ms. Camacho if they have something they would like to add.
Nothing here from me, but Barbara might have something.
Nothing from me.
All right, I'm not seeing anyone in the queue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the last, or getting down to the last of the general government departments here, the next one is the Equal Rights Commission. Again, this is a department that is basically between reports to the administration and the assembly, similar to internal audit and as proposed, the equity and justice. And so in Ms. Anderson's department here, what we have is we have positions. There's no change in really positions, a little bit of one-time adjustments, some salaries, very, very small, and then some changes in their proposed budget. I would note that since we've submitted the budget in the early part of the year, we've been having some conversations with this department, and there's a likelihood that there may be some more federal dollars coming their way. And we're going to be working with them to keep track of that. And I think, and the reason for that is their caseload is increasing a little bit, and the federal dollars are direct connection to, as I understand it, their caseload. And so what we're looking at is if that is going to happen, and they do need the support for additional labor, then we will recognize that federal dollars and then potentially make some adjustments to their labor as part of an S version or in first quarter. So Ms. Anderson's a little bit new to the position here. This is her first budget round, similar to Ms. Vogel. So we're been in communication with them. We're going to try and help them out if those federal dollars come in. I think with that, I just want to make the assembly aware that we are aware of that, and don't have anything else to add unless Ms. Anderson has something she'd like to add about the operations of the department itself.
Thank you so much, Lance. I don't have anything to add at this time.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you. This is kind of a cross-department question, but Mr. Wilbur, would it be possible to get the total amount on the reversals of 1Q one-time travel reductions overall for the municipality? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Don't see any further questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the last department in general government, except for the health department, which we'll pick up at the end of the day, is internal audit and Mr. Chadwick's team of individuals downstairs. Really some small changes inside his department. Again, the travel, the fuel, a request for some non-labor support as part of his business. So we tried to make a request there. And then obviously some of the changes in the salaries and the execs and non-reps. And so I just will say that Mr. Chadwick in our office, and I think many other offices, have a really good relationship, and we really appreciate his ability to reach out to us in Office of Management Budget when we need him, and gives us a heads up on things, and if always able to help him out, providing us some information. So it's also helpful to us in our management practices. So I just want to point that out. And unless Mr. Chadwick has anything to add, that's what I have for internal audit.
I have nothing else to add.
Thank you. All right, I don't see anyone in the queue. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right, Mr. Chairman, we're about a half an hour ahead of schedule. Do you want to continue, or do you want to take a short break and then jump into the utilities, take our break a little bit early, and then jump into the utilities and enterprises?
Let's go ahead and keep moving forward, and we'll take our break a little later.
Okay. Give us a moment to change presentations. We're going to pull up the utilities and enterprises. All right, before we get started with Anchorage Hydro Power, which will be our first one, I just want to point out a couple things. I mentioned this last week, that as you look at this year's utility and enterprise books themselves, you know that their presentation and their look's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more consistent than what you're normally looking at and seeing in general government, both for operating and capital. And so as you get an opportunity to take a look at those things, you may see some changes there. We were able to add a little bit of graphics. We've been progressively trying to improve the look and the readability of our capital budgets. And so and our budgets as a whole, make them a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more readable. And we try to make that first step here inside of our utility budgets. The other thing that we'll notice is for the capital projects, we put a little bit more detail into the books themselves. Instead of just a list of the projects, we've been working with the utilities and enterprises to add a little bit more content to the document itself. So it turned out a little bit thicker if you get copies or if you're reading it. So we made some changes there. And then probably the other point overall is, when we present the utilities and enterprise, we present an 8-year summary of what they look like. And, really we're trying to get more information that's representative of their financial situation and their stability, any of their their capital assets and some plans that they may have in place. So we're doing, make a little bit tweaks to make them a little bit better in that area as well. Individually, the departments have made changes, and we'll talk about them as we walk through them, but just kind of an overview when you look at the utility book itself. Just wanted to point that piece out. So the first department we're going to start with is the Anchorage Hydro, and Anna Henderson is not able to be with us today, so I will do my best to walk us through that, and I have our budget analyst, that's Christine Chestnut, who's on here to help me out if I need it to walk through. But I'll do my best kind of walking through Anchorage Hydro operating and capital, and then point out the highlights. And then if we have questions, we can certainly get back to Ms. Henderson. But to start out, just as a reminder, with the sale transactions of ML&P, we have a residual asset that for a power plant at Anchorage Hydro, and it's basically going to be operated and maintained by a combination of representative from the municipality of Anchorage, CEA, and MEA. And so for 2021, we have in 2020, what we did, we created this department in 2020, and we did it because we thought at the time that in early 2020 that we would sell ML&P, the transition would actually occur in July. And through changes and negotiations and timing, that didn't occur. So as we went into the third quarter and now looking at October, we will have a utility that we will have to maintain after ML&P is sold and that transaction is done. So we had planned on this utility being online a little bit earlier, but so when you see changes, a continued change from 2020 to 2021, you can see why this looks like a revised appropriation. It's because it's reflective of a department that would have been half in business this year or a portion of business and then the next year. So that's why you'll see some of these changes for pluses and minuses. I'll just point out, in this particular case, you'll see the changes in existing programs and funding for 21. We had initially put in, I think it was right around $500,000 for contractual and other services for the entire year in 2020. Obviously, we didn't need all of that. So in 2021, it would show a reduction of that amount with a leaving of about $150,000 for contractual services. So that's how we get to the negative or the reduction of $350,000. And we'll show you residual 150 lies. And then contributions to other funds, we'll talk about that. That's adjustments that it relates to the trust fund. So for the utility, there's no, in the proposed budget, there's no positions. The thought at the time is that the representation for the municipality might be through some contractual services. In talking with Anna and the rest of the senior managers, we may actually be looking at hiring an individual. So we may have some changes here rather than through some contractuals, particularly for the first year. But we haven't really decided on that yet, but there may be some changes here on that one. So I think I'm going to go ahead and go over to the 8-year summary. So this is a simplified version of the 8-year summary, and kind of a couple things I'll point out on this slide. The charges to other departments, that $35,000, that's a typical, the IGCs, that support services, whether it's procurement or finance or treasury or the controller, wherever it might be. It's primarily in the finance side of the support to that department. We'll also note that in the first year of operations, there is not an anticipation to be a dividend. And typically dividends are based on the previous year activity. And since really we don't have any of that, then we don't anticipate a dividend the first year of that utility. However, in the outer years, depending on how the utility will ultimately function, if they're in a positive net position after meeting their obligations, we are projecting that they'll have the opportunity to provide a dividend in the outer years. And then I think the big thing on this one I want to point out is the restricted cash, that $3,000. That's basically, it's $3 million. Through the agreement in the sale of ML&P, there was a requirement that we would keep $3 million in cash reserves inside that utility. And if that number goes down, if we dip into those cash, that will then inhibit our abilities in the future to receive a dividend. And so it's important that that $3,000 number in restricted cash be maintained to meet the original intent of the sale of the contract when we do the transaction documents. So I think that is where we're going to be. And then at the end of the year, we'll be in a positive to about $1 million. So, and then at the bottom, obviously they don't have any capital assets or beginning balance because really starting off as a brand new utility. So those are I think the highlights I want to point out in here. And I'm not sure if many assembly members had an opportunity to delve into this utility yet, but as you do, if you have questions, let me know. And then I'm going to go on to the next slide, Mr. Chairman, and then if we have questions on the 8-year summary or the revenues, I'll come back to that. So the next slide that you'll see in the budget is really sort of a reference to their revenues and expenses. And so really looking at their operating revenues. So with this utility, there will be a generation of power and a sale of power. So the first one is a wholesale of power that will go to Chugach Electric Association. So that contribution of the sale of that power, that will be a contribution that will come to the municipality, I believe, for the next 35 years. And that money will go directly into the trust. Like that is the terms, I believe, of the agreement. So you will see that $2.5 million looks very similar to when you go down to the operating expenses where we have contributions to other funds, $2.5 million. That's a reflective of revenue inside that utility from CEA, and then a contribution into that trust for the next 35 years. So that's a one-to-one there. The MEA portion of it, that's for their purchase of power and acquisitions for that. And that amount of dollars, those can be used for operating the utility, or those dollars can be moved into general government if it's needed. And then I'll do my best to do the water diversion payment. Obviously, there's if we lose water that might otherwise be used to generate power, there's a payment for that loss of a resource to generate power, and MEA pays that, and so we would get a revenue stream of about $400,000 from MEA, and then that too would come to the municipality. So I think those are the important pieces inside the revenue side and where the dollars are going to be going. Obviously we're going to put a little bit of money into investment, and then we have a little bit of money in the cash pool. So that's where the 60 and the 10 come into. We try to get it as close as we can based on the information we have. Then the next piece will be in the expense side. On the contractual and other services, that's the balance of that 150 that I talked about earlier. And if in the event that the administration decides that, doing contractual services to sort of represent our seat at the table is not the best approach, we will then turn those dollars into labor dollars instead of contractual. But we're talking about that right now. We're working with Anna to figure out how that might work. I think there is a good argument to be made that the first year out, it would be nice to have somebody that works with a municipality that has some sense of generation. So more to come on that conversation as we advance this budget process, and if we make some changes, be aware of that. And then I think the last piece, when you look down at the end, the first year of the utility, they're going to have a net income of about $1.7 million. And what we want to do for that is we're going to take roughly $700,000 of that and put it into capital. We'll take roughly about $500,000 of that and put it into cash to provide operations. And then in addition to that, we'll be help supporting additional capital improvements. But I think that is a good place to be. I think their net position would be down a little bit in the future years, but that is sort of a highlight of their operations and their financing on that. And before I go to the capital side, I'll attempt to address any questions that you have in the absence of Ms. Henderson, unless the assembly has questions right now.
Thank you. So I do have a question from Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation, Lance. Can you return back to the $3 million in restricted cash? And
yes,
you may have already explained this, but was that part of the closing and settlement, or presumably will be part of the LNP sale? Is there already $3 million in there, or will that be a result of the revenues from this year? Thanks.
Through the chair, Ms. LaFrance, that $3 million was part of, first, it is part of the requirement in the transaction, and second, it was part of the documents that the assembly approved to take $3 million, I believe it's from the cash, and park it in here to start off in 2021.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, I don't see any other questions.
Okay. So there's a couple small projects in Anchorage Hydro that we're responsible for. There's a little bit more detail, well, there's a lot more detail in the book, but they have a couple obligations. This first one here is a fish and wildlife study and work that they need to do as a result of the utility itself. There's about $480,000. This is an obligation that the utility will be responsible for. And then obviously they're going to have some capital needs inside the generation itself for the portion of the utility. And so pretty small, just a couple projects here on their capital side. And as I mentioned, a portion of their net $1.7 million year end, they're going to take 700,000 of that and help shore this and fund these programs right here. And that's all I have on the Anchorage Hydro, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions or discussion? All right, I'm not seeing any. Thank you.
All right. Okay, the next department is the Port of Alaska. And so with the port, there's only, first of all, the ports, there's not a lot of changes in the port overall. I did note that in the initial overview, not a significant amount of changes. They have a couple little tweaks inside their budget. A couple of them having to do with sort of as a result of a reorganization inside their department, where they have a couple positions that they were moving around. They're going to take some labor. They had a couple part-time positions. They're going to take the funding for those part-time positions, take away the 2 part-time positions and reallocate those to some contractual services for improvements to the Ship Creek boat launch. So that will be as part of our proposed budget. And then some adjustments to their MISA as a result of sets coming into the municipality. So some that's a cost to them. And then the dividend to general government, again, a cost to them. So those will be expenses to them that will come to general government. Really no other changes inside 2021 except for, again, there will be, even though they are similar to all the utilities and enterprises, the administration's proposal to reduce or to keep salaries for execs and non-reps flat would also apply to those departments as well, not just the general government ones. So that's a change there. And I think, on their operating side, really no other significant changes there. I'm going to go on to the 8-year summary, and then again, sorry for the small print. It's tough to get a lot of information, and I think it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to give you since these departments do not receive, all of these departments, the Anchorage Hydro, this one, and the others that we're going to talk about, do not receive any tax dollars. They are self-sufficient in their operations, both for their operations and their capital. We take a little bit more time to show some of the financing in here. And so a couple things to point out, while it shows their net income as their loss is at about 7 million, again, that includes depreciation. On the slide, there's a little note, a little footnote that's number 1 in the book. You'll note that that number 1 means that the expenses includes their total depreciation. So that's why that number looks to be negative. I don't recall the exact depreciation amount off the top of my head. I think the other thing I'd want to point out is if you go down, in 2021, the port is looking to do some bonds rather than long-term debt for borrowing. I think it's probably a reflection of the market itself and better cost to the dollar, but there will be a proposal to put some not geo bonds, revenue bonds out on the street for 60 million, and that would be to support the development of the port improvements. I think the important piece, I think that's the only significant change or point I wanted to make out there. And then if you go to the next slide, this is a highlight of their revenues and expenses. think, really the only other thing that we're doing here, there's really no big changes overall, a little bit of cleanup. I don't think I have anything that I want to point out here. We are looking into some changes to, I need to look into the changes for the investment income. You see that looks like it's swinging wildly, but I think that just has to do with the effect of the amount of money that the port has that was in the investment, and seeing some changes there. So I think overall the port's in pretty solid shape. They've been doing a great job sort of cleaning up their equity on their capital side. Obviously the Assembly's utility and enterprise is getting an update on their capital projects for the cement terminal. But other than that, I don't have anything to add. And then if Mr. Rebuffo has something that he would want to point out that I didn't, I'll give him the opportunity to do that before we talk about capital. And then if the Assembly has any questions, please let us know.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions right now. Did you have anything to add, Rebuffo?
I think the only thing I would add at this point is under the operating revenues miscellaneous, the decrease that we're going to forecast is the loss of the cruise ship season this year. That's going to amount to a little over $250,000. What's not factored in though is that we're seeing a greater than that loss increase in the refined petroleum business this year because of the transition of a lot of cargo, more than normal, being moved by air cargo aircraft as opposed to passenger aircraft, and that has increased the fuel sales to the airport. So I think we're going to see a wash and maybe a little bit of an uptick with respect to petroleum that'll wipe out that loss on the cruise ship side of things. But more to come as we get closer to the end of the year for that to play out. And that's all I have at this time.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions or discussion? All right, I'm not seeing any. Thanks so much.
All right, we're going to move on to the capital program for the port. Hopefully Steve is still with me. Just a couple things. The administration has obviously been interested in advancing the benefits of solar. And so one of the things the port is doing, I think they have a little bit of money to do an initial startup and to do some investigation on where there might be some opportunities to put a solar farm someplace down at the port. And if I recall, the benefits of the energy generated from this would offset the cost to the operating, particularly on the utility side for the port itself. I'll say that these others, some equipment that has at the port, improvements to the boat launch, and then obviously some drainage improvements, and then wharf pile enhancements. The last two, those are sort of standard constant upkeeps that they have in their capital budget, little by little, on an annual basis. So if Mr. Rebuffo has something to add on those that I wanted to highlight that I didn't, please chime in.
I'll just put a little bit more meat on the bones of the Port Energy Resiliency Initiative. Yeah, the $100,000 seed money for us to get started on some concepts. And we've been conversing with Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson and the port users down here. We brought Launch Alaska on board to help us walk through the whole process, because there's a lot of opportunity to not generate so much power that we can sell it back to a utility, but to provide a level of independence should something happen to the utility and we can't get the power feeds down into the port, so that we can stay open for business and be part of the solution and not part of the bigger problem for the municipality from a recovery standpoint. We've also been talking to the railroad to make part of this, make them part of this solution too, because train engines And if we can tie that in, then we can certainly get some benefits there. But solar is going to be at the crux of things. If we can harness that and save it in a battery, save it in a flywheel, that's the first part of creating a renewable energy source that doesn't have to burn a fossil fuel to do it. And the other contribution to that will come from the modernization program and the new cranes that generate power on the down lift. So capturing all of that and holding it for when we would need it on a rainy day is part of this solution here. And there's a lot of interest in helping, and there's a lot of collaboration that the Air Force is excited to participate with, because they have a need for this type of energy as well. They've taken care of most of the base, but oddly enough, the southwest corner is off of their grid for these kinds of issues, but that's what we abut right up against. So there's a mutual aid opportunity here as well that we don't want to squander. So this is going to be exciting, and there'll be more to talk about in the future. But this is going to get us started.
Great, thank you, Mr. Robucco.
You're welcome.
Is there any questions or discussion?
Yep, this is Mr. Constant.
Go ahead, Mr. Constant.
So the top line there, the solar farm, I just want to put a marker on the table that the neighborhood has concerns over this project, and that the piece of land that it's proposed upon was transferred to the municipality with some limitations on it, with a commitment that whatever it goes in there isn't going to become another industrial face to the neighborhood. And so Mr. Buffalo and I are working on this now, and I'm confident we can come to a good solution that everybody buys into. But I just want to make sure that's on the Assembly's dashboard going forward.
And I'll agree with that. I get more confident that we can come to a solution that's mutually agreeable every day. We did meet with Steve Gerlich and Jody Solis earlier in the week, and actually saw what their vision was for that area there. And I think this is doable, and one not intruding on the other. So we're one step closer to being able to, all of us being able to have our cake and eat it too on this one here too. So more to come.
Thank you. All right, seeing no further discussion, thanks so much.
Continue, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you want to start with Merrell Field, or you want to take 15 minutes right now?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Let's go ahead and take our 15.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. We'll be starting again in 5 minutes. We'll be starting in 1 minute. All right, let's get started again. Mr. Wilbur.
think we're left off and at Merrell Field. So we'll start with Merrell Field on their operating side. So a couple things, just some highlights, overview of Merrell Field. You know, Merrell Field was a beneficiary of a large FAA COVID funds in 2020 that will be assisting Merrell Field not only this year, not only the department itself, but also those that use the field out there, whether they're leaseholders or operators out there, either through some benefits in the operating expenses or some ability to make some larger capital advance or improvements that then otherwise to have not been able to make in the past. So these funds, I think, is going to be a benefit, and they're reflected in the budget itself for operating and capital. But with that, I think, you know, we make a little bit of adjustments on their salaries and their benefits. There's going to be a little bit of a change in their MISA. That's a contribution similar to to the port, where there's an expense to them that would come to the municipality. There's no, they have a little bit of a change in the personnel, and that has to do primarily with the new simulators that Mr. Gibbs out at Merrell Field is, I think, really taken an opportunity to take advantage of an asset that was benefited in the past and maybe at rest, and picking those simulators up and making them available to folks that are in the aviation business and industry. And so we have picking up a couple positions, or a position scheduler to help do that, a couple part-time folks, or a couple positions in there. And then we also had some changes in the maintenance tech. So again, some changes where they'll reduce one of their part-time positions. But I think on the operating side of the world, they're in pretty good shape. I'm going to go over to the next slide, which is their 8-year summary, and just point out a couple things here. Similar to the port, the net income that you see in there includes depreciation. I actually think that depreciation is closer to $3 million. So I think they're pretty much right on their revenues and expenses minus depreciation. I think the other thing I want to show here is, you know, it's really, their operating cash is pretty small at the moment. However, they do not have any debt, and that is a good thing for Merrell Field. And then the next thing I probably want to point out is the next slide, Lila. On the revenues expenses, when you see the changes in the rental at the top, you'll see some changes in their property lease fees and their parking fees. That is a reflection of their ability to use CARES funds to sort of offset some of those expenses that might otherwise be a required contribution from the leaseholders and those that are parking their vehicles out there. Also see some benefits from that in the next line, where you see operating grant revenues at $390,000. That's primarily CARES funds that are helping sort of offset that, and also in supporting the simulators and the operations for running the simulators. And then if you move down where you see contractual services and other services, the $75,000, that I believe is directly related to the change for the increase related to those things related to the simulators. Other than that, I think their day-to-day operations for the business at Merrell Field is the same. They are working on some exciting opportunities outside the simulations, and I think the next thing I want to go to is, before I go to their capital, I will ask Mr. Gibbs if there's something that he wanted to touch on the revenues or expenses or just their day-to-day operations going on. I'll ask him to add if he has anything he'd like to jump in with.
Thank you, Lance. The only thing I might throw in is that our airport operations are up by 22% when you compare the last 2 years to the previous 4. So revenue.
Thank you, Ralph.
Before we move
Thanks. So I have a couple of questions. First from Mr. Constant.
Thanks. Speaking of revenue and simulators, 2 questions. One is, do we anticipate some revenue to come from those simulators? And the second question is, the $75,000 of maintenance costs, is that a one-time cost, like the cost of getting them installed and set up and kind of calibrated, or is that something we anticipate from now on?
Through the chair, Mr. Constant, I believe our the cost, the 10% cost was around 75,000. I don't anticipate a 75,000 to operate them. We are going to charge $50 an hour so that they will be self-sustaining. It's part-time work. We have a building on site, but our cost initially to get them is just under 75,000. But once they're here and once we have them operating and we're charging $50 an hour with 4 part-time persons to do the scheduling, there's not going to be an additional expense to the municipality for them to continue.
Yeah, they should be self-sufficient at that rate. Great. So this line on this slide, new simulator maintenance, is that accurate then, or is that just a kind of a word issue?
I will verify, through the chair, Mr. Constant, that actually, based on Mr. Gibbs's comments, we'll verify, but that new simular maintenance, that may be a one-time expense just as they bring them on and get them, because I think they have been in storage, but we'll verify if that 75 for maintenance is ongoing as a separate cost beyond the $50 per hour maintenance, but we will verify that.
No, so what he said was $50 an hour revenue per simulator per person. The 75,000 Mr. Gibbs referenced was the 10% cost share of getting them here, which I'm not sure the details. So yeah, just some clarity on that line would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant.
Ms. Zoloto?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we had raised parking and lease rates, and I was wondering if there was any effect on demand after those raises. And then I need a little bit more information about how the CARES Act funds were deployed to offset some of those costs, because that's something a little bit new to me.
Through the chair, ma'am, let me parse that out. So last year we went up by 3 cents a square foot. 2021 we're supposed to go up by another penny. But I think the answer to your question about the impact is I have a waiting list for parking spots. So I've not seen a mass exodus, if that's an implication in your question, because of those increases. With regard to the deployment of the CARES, there were some new things, some new innovative things that we're pushing. One is the simulators, as we talked. The other are some instrument approaches at the airport. We only have one, it's a non-precision, and so we're trying to get lower weather minimum approaches so that folks don't have to divert over to Ted Stevens. But by and large, what we're using the CARES funds for is to pay match requirements on the AIP grants that we get. And also, because we couldn't afford the match for these AIP, these Airport Improvement Program grants, I had pushed out several things that the FAA had approved us to do because we couldn't afford the match. So the majority of the CARES funds are going to be spent on those things previously approved that we couldn't afford to do, but that we can afford to do now.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, I don't see any other questions. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to Merrell Field's capital program. I think so many of the capital improvements in 2021 will be supported with AIP and the FAA CARES funds that they were able to receive. I think one of the most exciting pieces of capital work here is the acquire of the city electric property. And I won't steal Mr. Gibbs' thunder about the great opportunity for what could go into that building there. I would say that some of these other projects that we have are relatively consistent and the same as in the past, with the exception that, as Mr. Gibbs just alluded to, many of these things are something that he's been wanting to do, or the Merrell Field operations have been wanting to do and have not had the capacity, either had the capital or the match to match their regular airport improvement program for FAA. So in 21, they got a bit of a blend. They got their regular airport money from FAA they get on an annual basis. That is a contribution to them from FAA if they have the match, in addition to their CARES funds that they plan to sort of program over the next 5 years on, as he just alluded to, primarily on capital improvements. But I think if the assembly members have any particular questions on how that process is working or how these projects are going to carry out, I'll yield to Mr. Gibbs on that.
Lance, through the chair, if I could just offer or point your eyes to the equity column, there's nothing there. We're able to use the CARES funds for match. So in that federal column, there's a mixture of FAA, AIP grants, CARES development money, which is similar to the AIP, but there are no match requirements because it's all coming out of CARES.
Thank you. All right, I don't see any questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ralph.
Yes, sir.
Right, our next department is solid waste, and as similar to the water utility, solid waste, they have a disposal and refuge, and we're going to take each one of those individually, and we'll walk through them on their operating and then on their capital, and then we'll go to the other portion of their business. So on the solid waste disposal side, I think what I wanted to point out here is, really they don't have a whole lot of changes on the disposal side of the house. There's some minor changes going on in their salaries and their overtime, but pretty small. They do have some non-labor contractual increases that they have, so they're asking for some additional increase in their expenditure authority to address those. And then they have requested for an expenditure authority to address some work that they're doing on their landfill care and closure program. And then when you get down to the end, they do want to add a new position, and this would be funded with the revenues that are generated inside solid waste. And that would be for a new journeyman position in their disposal side. And so I think on the operating side, I don't have much to add. I think overall for solid waste, they're running it very well. Obviously, their mind is focused, at least from our perspective at OMB, is focused on their large capital improvements that they have at the central transfer station. And as we will talk on the next couple slides here, they are going to propose a rate increase to, there should not be surprises. So on the top where we have their revenues and expenses, you can see that they're in a positive territory in this one. And this one actually, I believe, this one also includes their depreciation. So they're in pretty good shape, and that's good to see. I think the next piece I want to point out is, and you'll see it a little bit more with AWU, it's super important for these utilities to make sure that they have enough capital on hand to cover any amount of the debt that they might have. And Lila, can you point to the loan, the 6.4, the highlighted column? Down, right up. So right there, what you see is their total debt service coverage. You'll see it says 1.64. And what that means is they have basically 1.64 amount of money to cover their debt requirements, and their debt requirements are at 1.15. I should have pointed this out a little bit earlier, but as you're looking at the utilities, I think those are some important things to see. We never want to see that their cash is in a situation where they can't cover their debt. It has to be equal to their debt requirement. And so part of what we've been working with the utilities is to not only make sure that that is the case, and they're doing a great job in that regard, just in our way to illustrate it in these sheets here. So I think I meant to point that out earlier, but I pointed out for solid waste. And then at the bottom, you can also see that there is a proposed annual rate increase, and that 6.25% on the disposal side of their business is, I think, part of their pro forma that they put together when they were building their master plan for their capital improvements, not only out at the central transfer station, but any improvements they might be making out at ARL, Anchorage Regional Landfill, which we'll see in the next couple slides here. The other thing, similar to solid waste and AWU, is their disposal business and their refuse business, as well, it's sort of two separate business types. Their operations are linked together, and whether it's in their customer service or in their administration. So there's not duplication in those arenas. They make sure that they're doing what they can to provide some efficiencies there. And so that's important to, I think, just point out, not only for this utility, but for this department, but also for AWU when we get there. So the next slide, I just want to point out, I think there's a lot of information in here. You'll see on their revenue, probably the fourth or fifth line down, where it says landfill methane gas sales. Their actuals were about $2.5 million. And so when we look at their 2020 budget, they see a revenue increase of over $500,000 there. And that's a lot of the work that Mr. Spafford and his team are looking at on how they can get the best economic value of the gas that would be generated in the field or in the regional landfill. So that's really a good news statement. I wanted to point that out to the Assembly. I think everything else in their revenue side, other than that one right there, I think those are the big changes that I recall that I wanted to point out to the Assembly on their operating side as it relates to their revenues and expenses. And I'll ask Mr. Spafford if he has anything he wants to add in before we get to capital, or if there are questions from the Assembly members.
No, you did great, Lance.
Thank you. So I do have one person in the queue, Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the revenue side, when there's something like the additional revenue for the methane capture, how does that work with the rate increases? Is that taken into account? I know the pro forma had rate increases over a period of time and set those forward, but when there are additional revenues found or generated, is there any offset then back to the ratepayer?
Yeah, I mean, this is Spafford. The direct, basically that landfill methane, the sales help to stabilize our rate increases over time. And so basically that's helping us to keep our rates from having to go, from 6.25, like we have proposed, to something higher than that. And so that's kind of the way that fund has always acted, since 2013, 2014, since we started acquiring revenue from that.
May I ask a quick follow-up?
Go ahead.
Thanks. So maybe I'm not understanding. It sounded like there was increased revenues that were maybe somewhat unexpected. And so that's the question. When the increased revenue is above what was maybe projected, is that, I understand it's stabilizing the overall rate increases, but is it offsetting, when we make more than we were expecting? Is it going to offset those rate increases, or is the threshold so high that that's unlikely, and it's just going to keep us on the rate increase track that we are currently on.
That's correct, Meg. Yes.
And I also see Mr. Slivka may want to respond to this.
Yes, and through the chair, if Lance, if you could go back one slide, I just wanted to highlight what we had mentioned before. If you look at the column in 2023 under debt service requirement, where he's indicated we have a requirement to maintain, and this is a ratio of net revenue over expenses of 1.15%. And you see down below, we're projecting, even with rate increases in 22 and 23, to only just barely meet that debt coverage ratio. So while it's nice that we get possibly some small benefit to some of these changes in revenue for methane, it's so small in comparison to their overall revenue and expense requirements relating to the amount that they're going to have to borrow in order to continue to rebuild the transfer station.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the clarification. As you know, constituents are always worried about rate increases, and I like to be able to tell the whole story.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. Yeah, you know, the question of the rate increases, I am wondering, I think we've done 2 or 3 now. So how are we in the context of getting to the point where we're at the, where the curve is kind of on point? Are we still queuing up more? I heard we are for one more. Is there more after that?
Through the chair, Mr. Constant, you can see in this proposed budget that there's a 6.25 rate increase annually for the next 5 years.
Ooh, okay.
And I think that, again, as Mr. Slivka alluded to, with that, that gets us and that keeps us in that territory where our amount of cash available is just, you know, right at the minimum amount, particularly in 2023, where the amount of cash that we have is just almost exactly the amount of debt requirement that we have. And maybe to Ms. Zolotel's question about the 500,000, the reason that we made that adjustment in 2021 is we go forward. We based that additional $500,000 where you see the percent change. We based it on their actuals in 2019, and so we, you know, in 2020 we didn't see that number. We made a projection of what it would be at like 2.6, but then we backed it down a little bit, and then we looked at the actuals in 19, and that's what made us make this adjustment. So we have some reaction. And I think that is the time, and Mr. Spafford and his team can correct me if I'm wrong, but that is also the time when they were putting the pro forma together for the investment they wanted to make and their proposed rate increases that they needed to propose when they were putting their master plan together. So we're just reflecting those realities of actuals then to this point. And we're going to make an assumption that the amount of money that they brought in on gas in 19 is going to be close to 21. So that is why we made the change.
Yeah, and Lance, this is Spafford. Just to add to that, I mean, we had also not projected an increase in 2020 because we had assumed that the military was going to have Doyon operating that plant at a lesser capacity. And again, that has to do back to the, you know, to the rate that JBER pays for power from MLMP. And so we were expecting a decrease in landfill gas cells that just didn't materialize.
And I believe Mr. Slivka wants to weigh in on this.
Not on this, but just broadly to Mr. Constant's question, that we would be more than willing to provide the information in terms of how these rate increases have been relative to inflation over the years. Just as a reminder that prior to getting on this path a few years ago, rates had not been raised for many a year. And I think we have at least 2 or 3 more years until we just catch up with the rate of inflation over the last 10 years. And then, of course, the final thing to remember is still at these current rates, I believe that we are still charging half of what gets charged out in Matsu Valley. So, I think Mr. Spafford and his team have done a tremendous job operating this utility. And we, of course, are extraordinarily sensitive to what people have to pay. And we're doing our very best to keep these at a bare minimum while providing the services that Anchorage needs.
So
Yeah,
I
just
Chair.
yeah, and just to add to that, to what Alex just said, I mean, and not to say that just because our rates are half of what our, neighboring and peer utilities are, but that just kind of gives you the perspective, like Alex said, about, how historically this utility has been operated and how really affordable we are, again, relative to some of our peers in the state as well as within the Northwest region of the United States.
So, Mr. Chair, I agree with all of that. And I think that it didn't come out with the rate increases that were just moved, but we should communicate to the public at some point this whole picture, other than in this spreadsheet in this document, no one's ever going to see but us, how we expect this to happen over the next few years, because people don't like to be surprised. And the more we kind of share with them this rationale, the less hard it's going to be. I imagine it's going to get harder and harder to do this as the years go by, when the numbers go up 6%, 6%, 6% with no end in sight. And so I agree, everything is accurate and done right, and we should be doing this. And at the same time, I think we need to communicate the strategy of this, or the kind of midterm picture of this, better to the ratepayers.
Yep, and through the chair, to answer your question, Chris, I mean, the majority, again, we don't want to raise our rates just because, willy-nilly or anything like that, but just to put it in perspective, customers, like I'm an Alaska Waste customer, a 6.25% increase on disposal, and you can see this in the RCA filings that Alaska Waste put together for a typical customer of theirs is going to be like a 30-cent per month increase on their residential garbage bill. Commercial customers probably won't even see an increase in their fees, just because for commercial customers, the majority of the cost that's associated with their service is with labor and gas and just driving a vehicle around. And not to say that makes it better or worse or anything like that, but that just kind of gives you the perspective about what the impact will be on a typical residential customer outside of our service area.
I appreciate and get all of that, and at the same time, if we want to be successful at this table in the years to come, the public needs to understand. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, I don't see anything else. Thank you.
All right, we're going to move on to disposal of their capital program. Again, I don't see anything significantly different on this one here. Obviously, the regional landfill leachate design, they're going to look to borrow some dollars for that. I can't recall what program that is. Mr. Spafford may be able to enlighten me on that one, or Mr. Slifka. But other than that, I think their regular programs inside their disposal is just day-to-day operations, maintenance, capital maintenance, and improvements on the assets that they have in place. And I think the gas monitoring system at the landfill is, a larger plan that they're going to start some design work on initially. But other than that, unless Mr. Spafford or Mr. Slifka wants to add on to that, I think their capital program is pretty standard.
And Lance, what was I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first question or the first statement you had that I could shed some light on possibly for the debt?
Yes, the source.
That is from the Clean Water Loan Fund through the state of Alaska.
Thank you.
And then the majority of the gas construction system monitoring is to help us to address our, we're making up for the mistakes of the past, and we're trying to play catch up with getting the gas collection system at the landfill that we truly need. And as you may or may not be aware, we're in the middle of a pretty contentious notice of violation with the state of Alaska and EPA because of odors at our landfill. So hopefully what this will do will go a long way to address their concerns, as well as, the concerns that have been voiced by, public members driving by the landfill. And also it helps us to better improve our methane collection and reduce, greenhouse gas emissions from the landfill too, of course.
Thank you, Mark.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Thank you.
Let's move on to the refuse side of their business. So on the refuse side, obviously, there's really no changes on there, no changes on the refuse side. It's obviously, other than some minor changes, modifications or adjustments as required. Same number of people, so nothing changed. There's pretty vanilla from this year to next. So I don't have much else to report on that one. And then I think as we go into their 8-year summary and their revenues and expenses, again, their net income is positive as they're looking to go into 21. Similarly, as you look down the chart, you can see that their outstanding debt is going to be climbing a little bit because of the investments that they're making. That should not be a surprise. And then the next item is down on the rate increases. So this side of the utility is proposing a 5% rate increase, and similar to the collections side, this would be an annual, it would go up 5% annually for the next 5 years as proposed here. And I think, Mr. Constant, your earlier comment about communicating the why we're doing this, and I think Mr. Spafford's comment about the 30 cents, I think we can do a better job, and we'll work with Mark and his team to see how we can illustrate that in our messaging, because it is an important point. On the refuse side, really on their operations, there's not a lot of changes. Unless there's something I missed, Mr. Spafford, please jump in.
No, I just like to, good job again, Lance, of course. But I just wanted to plug in, we've been continuing to increase the level of services that we provide with the collection entity, such as adding, we're doing commercial glass collection. We're trying out, small residential glass collection. All of the organics collection activities that we've added, we haven't had to add any staff. And so that's something I like to point out for everyone, is that we've been able to provide these additional services to the community, specifically our service area, and have not had to increase our overall staff count. So it's just kind of a pat on the back for the people that work there.
Thank you. Right, I'm not seeing any questions. Thanks so much.
So before Mr. Spafford is, before we're done with solid waste here, just again on their capital side of their program, they're building out off of, I think it's, what is that, 56th or 58th, the building where Mark's office and his administrative team are. They'll be looking to do some roof work out there, and then some standard improvements and replacements of carts and things that they need to maintain their operations of their refuse. So no real surprises here. Obviously, they have heavy equipment and other operational needs, and so they'll be using their own equity to fund those things. And again, my compliments to this utility and the others. We've been working with them to really kind of clean up sort of the amount of equity that they had programmed for projects that actually either came in under or they just didn't happen, and the equity was still sort of on the books. So it made their debt to equity ratio look a little skewed, but we've been cleaning that up. And I think, akin to what Ms. Marshall was saying earlier, looking back to make sure they're using all of their old money, making sure that they're cleaning up their old equity here, in this case here, and the departments, the utilities are doing a great job to work with us to make sure that that's getting cleaned up. And so my compliments to Solid Waste and the others that they're helping us do this. It's good management practice. So I don't have anything else on the capital side for refuse, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark.
All right, thank you.
So the next utility that we're going to talk about is Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility. And similar to solid waste, they sort of have two separate businesses, but there are parts of their businesses that are linked. And so when we make any adjustments in one, it impacts the other. And similarly, and probably more so with the Anchorage Wastewater Utility, their ability to add additional services at any point, at least in this proposed budget, is going to necessitate either reductions in other services or some other changes in their revenue stream. But I think I tried to make a point when I mentioned this last week, and I know that Mr. Corsentino and his team had a work session with the Assembly last week on their proposed rate increases that are included in this budget. But I just kind of want to set the stage for the utility as I mentioned it before. I mean, this utility particularly has been really impacted with COVID-19 as it relates to their revenues on their side of the house. And as a result, their 21 proposal is, I think, taking a very smart, if not a conservative look on how they're going to manage their expenses in anticipation of, one, no lost revenues that they have right now, and I think how their changes potentially could affect next year. And as we talk about their rate increases would not take effect until after the first quarter. And so they are mindful of that. And as I go through this, I think this is the one utility that we will be looking at in first quarter if we need to make some adjustments, just as a result of their revenues as a whole. They're at the end, they're going to be their water utility budget is going to be reduced. Their wastewater or their water utility proposal is going to be a little bit less, and their wastewater is going to be relatively flat. There's not going to be any dividends. I think Mark and his team are doing a great job being mindful of the store, not that they aren't in the past, but I do think that new circumstances here. And so as we walk through this, I'll try to highlight some of those things, but that's really, I want to set the stage for the utility here. They are in a situation as a business where the revenues are not coming in, so they are holding positions vacant. They are reducing their contract expenses. They are doing everything they can to make sure that they're managing their business. And at the same time, they do have to have some small rate adjustments that they'll be proposing to the RCA. So sort of with that groundwork and that background, sort of highlight the utility as a whole and maybe a little bit more detail here. So on their changes from their existing programs to 21, obviously we're going to make some changes in their salaries as they're required by bargaining. They have plumbers and pipe fitters, IBEW, AMEA. They have, I think they have a group, many of the bargaining units inside the water utility. So they do have some known changes. They had some requests. They know that they have some insurance, some obligations on their insurance. This issue with bad debt, I think the point I want to point out there is really, that's in anticipation of 2020 non-collectible or uncollectible revenue from services that are coming in the door. And so they know that that debt expense is going to hit them in 2021. So that's an additional expense they have to make up for. Obviously, we adjusted their travel. We had some other changes in here on their overhead, but pretty minor as a whole. And then I think the other highlight here that I wanted to point out is, I guess their interest during construction is going to be up a little bit. I'll let them speak to their depreciation. Obviously, they have a lot of assets, and then as those assets depreciate, they need to make sure that they account for that in their budgeting process. And then as we go down to their budget changes, obviously what you're looking at is a lot of reductions. And as we talked a lot about that, I mean, the first two are administrative proposals from us to the utility. But again, they are asking us to make some one-time adjustments in their vacancy factor. So they're going to be basically saving some money, and then decreases in their supplies for services. So they're doing everything. And then obviously you mentioned that, you know, as a result of that, in order for them to keep in a positive position where they have enough cash on hand, which is roughly 24 million to meet their current debt, or their cash is at 24 and their debt's at, I think, 20. Well, we'll get to it. But their debt to equity, their cash on hand is covering their debt. So I think they're doing a smart thing right here. And then I'm going to go on, let's go to the 8-year summary. I think, I mean, I talked about this, their net income loss is, like, obviously they're in a positive position here. And if you look down, as we've talked with the other utilities, right in the middle, their debt service requirement is 1.15. And then their coverage is at 1.15. So they are right on it, right here. And so this is the place where I kind of wanted to make it a point. They're managing it to the penny is the best way I can sort of explain it. It's sort of unique this year, and I just think it's a matter of circumstance that they have done that. You'll see here that this is the place where we talk about the water utility getting a rate increase of 2%. And as you recall from the work session, this is the proposal. This would have to go to the RCA. And then again, the RCA would make a decision next year, and then this rate would go into effect in April. But then there will be adjustments in the out years on that. So I think on the next page for revenues, I'll let Mr. Corstantino jump in on this after I'm done here, but the highlight I want to recognize is at the top. Obviously, the demand for water in the commercial side is down, and it's affecting their bottom line by over $2.5 million. It's almost a 20% decrease. While they see a small increase in their residential, their revenue in this side of the ledgers is not a good sign, but they're managing that. Again, one of the results of that is without there being in a more positive position, their ability to support a general government with a dividend for now is been removed, which is the right thing to do. So I think on the water utility operating side, if Mr. Corstantino wants to add anything, any highlights to that before we get to capital, or if assembly members you have questions. Obviously, his team has been briefing the assembly on their rates, their cost of service study that they're considering, and obviously briefing the Assembly's Enterprise and Utilities Committee. But if there's something on their budget as it relates to the water utility, Mark, please chime in.
No, you did a good job, Lance. I appreciate it. The only other thing I'd add to that is that, as Lance said, our revenues have gone down on the commercial side, but our water demand overall has not gone down. In other words, people, instead of working at work, they're working at home. Schools are closed. Kids are at home. Restaurants and bars, they're closed. So that commercial usage is down, but people are at home. So their residential use has gone up. But we don't get additional revenue on residential accounts because we don't meter. So that's one of the downsides of it. So we don't get the expenses, and the demand is the same on the water side and the sewer as well. But there's no additional revenue. And as a fact, there's lost revenue on the commercial side because the meter accounts are down.
Thank you, Mark.
Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Corstantino, do we expect similar results going into 2021 in terms of the demand, or the type, not the demand, I'm sorry, the type of demand and the effects on revenue? And is that what we're kind of preparing for? Or do we, I mean, and then we're going to just hope for something better, or is there a shift in strategy?
No, good question. No, we budgeted for the decrease in demand. That's why we've cut our budgets and we've had to ask for a rate increase to compensate for that. We're entitled to a larger rate increase, but we're not asking for it. We're also tightening our belts And because we do expect this continued trend through next year, at least a good portion of it. There's some uncertainty. And what Lance said is if things change, we'll be back to look at a first quarter budget adjustment, whatever the things change, we would come back to the body to see if we can do an adjustment. But until that time, this is one of the more worst case scenarios we anticipate.
And if I may ask just a quick follow-up.
Sure.
Thanks. Mr. Cristino, has there, or Mr. Wilbur, has there been any CARES or federal relief for your utility due to the pandemic?
Great question. So, and someone else may elaborate from the administration too, but lost revenue is not eligible. At least at this time, it has not been eligible for CARES relief. So we've seen no CARES relief at this time. Now, the FEMA eligibility for bad debt expense could be eligible, but that's a question. And geez, we're still working with earthquake relief money, so it is years out before we get there. So at this point in time, there's again, we're taking more of a conservative approach. We're accounting for it. Some of those expenses, direct expenses, we're accounting for it for future recovery, meaning like, we're screening our employees before they come in the office as we buy chemicals to clean things. We're tracking that as FEMA recoverable down the road. But the bad debt expenses and lost revenue at this point, certainly the revenue is not recoverable. The bad debt's questionable. And so we're tracking it all, but we don't know where that's going to go.
Thank you.
Thanks. So first, we have a comment from Grant. I just wanted to make sure that that's on the record. So if you could verbalize that comment, please.
Mr. Chairman, my apologies. I was in another chat and it was going elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Slivka, you wanted to weigh in?
The only thing through the chair was partial to Member Zalatel's question is, as Mr. Costantino stated correctly, CARES funds can't be used for that. The only thing that we have seen other communities do is that they have used CARES grants to provide grants for payment of utility bills. So while we can't give the utility money, if the assembly thought that this was a valid goal, they could possibly allocate some of the CARES grant funds towards a utility payment fund, but that would be the only way that you could utilize CARES grants to address this issue.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the Anchorage Water Utilities Capital Program. I will just, I think of all of the infrastructure that the water utility has, there are no real big changes going on in here. I think the one thing I do want to point out is that sort of in the middle, you'll see this a Klutno water treatment facility. That has nothing to do with Anchorage Hydropower, just to be clear, two totally separate facilities in case anyone was potentially making that connection. And then I think, on their capital side, the way in which they've got their debt, obviously they work with a clean water loan, similar to Mr. Spafford mentioned. So if they have the opportunity to use that, then they do. Other than that, if there's questions on particular projects, I'll yield to Mr. Costantino if there are questions from the assembly or if one of these the utility would like to emphasize.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions right now. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. So let's move on to the wastewater utility. I think a similar story. They're managing this portion of the utility in a manner similar to as we just discussed on the water side. Really no change in the personnel. Obviously, contractual stuff we're going to do. They have I think the one thing on this one here on the bottom where you see a 301H sewer discharge permit. That's permitting requirements that they need to do related to Ostland as it relates to EPA and to making sure they're meeting the permit requirements out there. And so that's a necessity that we got to do out there. Other than that, you'll see that, again, they're making reductions in their contracts, their supplies. anything they can do on their labor side to reduce those expenses, giving their projections on their revenues, and trying to continue to meet their required obligations for legal or permitting purposes. They reallocating their dollars to make sure those needs are met. So really no other significant change on the water utility business operating side. And the same story is going to be the case as we cruise through their 8-year summary and their revenues and expenses. You'll note that on their commercial sales for wastewater, it's down almost $2 million. So a similar story in their wastewater side as to their water side. And again, efficiencies in a change in one can a change in the other. These individuals, they have specialties in the utility, but it doesn't mean that they're single to one portion of it. An individual could be working on the water or wastewater side. So again, my compliments to Mark and Grant and Casey and everyone else on the team over there. They do a great job. We appreciate their help on our end as well. So I don't have anything to add, Mr. Chairman, on the operating side for the utility on wastewater. Mark, if you have something you want to jump in on, please add.
Likewise, you did a good job, Lance. I think the only other thing I'll emphasize, what you did is the 301H permit, which has been on a EPA 20-year administrative extension. They are actively going through all those administrative extensions and making people reapply, or all the different utilities around the U.S. And so we're on the block. That's the one where there's the consequence of not getting that permits, on the $1 billion range. So our mission statement is to safeguard the public health and the environment, and the Endangered Species Act of the beluga whales put a certain highlight on this permit. And so we want to make sure we're good stewards of the environment, and we can show our goal is to show we can continue to do that. So for the next 3 years, actually, we're going to see increased budgets and make sure we do all the studies we have to do to make sure we coordinate with the federal agencies and can show that we're not having an adverse impact on the wildlife. If it does indeed show that we are, then we would have to consider some sort of changes or upgrades, which would be extremely expensive and extremely challenging down the road. So there's some concern for us down the road. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. All right, I don't see anyone in the queue right now. Thanks so much.
Let's wrap up with their capital side. On their capital side, Mr. Chairman, again, I think the program itself is not changing a lot in the capital types of work that they're doing. So the programs and the projects themselves, they're going to look very familiar. They obviously are continuing to work out at King Street, their major facility south of Diamond, off of King Street. So honestly, you look at their capital investments and it's going to mirror pretty much what they've done in the past. One of the things that we've been doing with the utility is to work with them to make sure that they've got the flexibility to respond a little more quickly. So in their capital program, so we've been working with them to do that. And I think that's going to benefit them going into 21 that we've been working with them that they didn't have in the past. So that's a process improvement on both our ends. So, but as far as the work itself, unless Mr. Corsentino wants to highlight one of these things, I'm not sure there's anything to recognize. As I review this, I will point out that maybe Mr. Dunbar might see that the third project down, or I'm not sure district this one is, but we talked about PM&E. They're doing a design work on 42nd Avenue. That project is on the east side of Tudor. This one is on the west side of Tudor. This is west of the storm improvements are on the west side of Lake Otis. I'm sorry, west side of Lake Otis, that East 42nd Avenue project. So anyway, just to make sure that when you see 42nd Avenue improvements, one's on one side of the street, the other one side of Lake Otis, the other one's on the other side of Lake Otis. So just as a point of information.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Oh, no, I was just noting for Lance that I believe that's in your district, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Salatel.
That is correct. Thank you. All right, I don't see anyone else in the queue. Thank you.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you all.
All right, the next department that we have is the Anchorage Community Development Authority. And I think Mr. Halcrow and his team are in a similar situation as it relates to the revenues and their businesses and the model that they have to look at and the changes that they are making and the changes that they are forecasting that they will need to make going from this year to next year are reflective of the economic climate. And I think as a result of declining revenues coming downtown, primarily as it relates to the parking side, and then also a little bit of reduction in their lease space and some other operating. Mr. Halcrow's team on their revenue side is it's down almost about $1.2 million. As you read the description and the changes, he's made some significant changes in his staff. I will ask him to jump in when we get there, but I think the number is down by almost half in order to support be realistic in the amount of expenses that they have towards their revenues that have come in. So as you can see, they're making some significant reductions in their labor by about $700,000. Then obviously some reductions in other services based on the combination of available resources and available and need. There are some changes that are going on inside his business as a whole. So I think on their operating side, Mr. Halcrow's team has done the right approach to basically recognize that their revenues are frankly taking a beating. And thus they have to make some significant changes in their operating in order to accommodate that for proposal into 21. So when you look at their overall bottom line, their total amount of their appropriation document is going to be down almost $2 million. So anyway, I think I know Andrew has a lot of good information. We've talked with the administration and OMB have talked to him about his needs and some of the ideas that he's got going on, but reflective of the actual fiscal environment as it relates to his day-to-day business is hampering him, and so he's making those changes. So again, my compliments to Mr. Halcrow for doing what needed to be done, even if it as difficult as it was. So I don't have much more to add than that. Obviously, there's a lot of details that he can share, Mr. Chairman. And Andrew, if you have something that you'd like to jump in, please do before we get to your capital.
Sure, that would be great. Thank you, Lance, through the chair. Thank you for this opportunity to present our look forward, if there is such a thing, to 2021. A couple of things. When the pandemic hit in March, we had 48 full-time employees. Within a month, we'd reduced our staffing almost down to 20. We reduced almost 50% of our labor. In the last 6 months, we have poked back up just due to demands and seasonality. We are currently at 27 full-time employees. We anticipate holding there not just for the rest of the year, but until further business levels dictate it. So right now, compared to a year ago, we're operating at almost less than 50% of our workforce. In doing that, year to date, we've saved 35% on payroll. I anticipate by the end of the year, we will have a year-to-date savings on payroll of 40%. Certainly that reflects the revenue challenges that Lance touched on. Our revenue challenges, are not a mystery. You can clearly see the amount of available parking when you drive downtown. To put that into perspective, to put that into numbers, year-to-date revenue for ACDA is down 36%. I anticipate it being down another 4 or 5%, maybe closing the year down around 41% over last year. The biggest hits we've suffered, on-street metered parking down 55%, daily parking. This is what we call transient parking, those people that are pulling into the garages to go to the mall, to go to City Hall. Daily parking is down 70%. We have been spared a little on our lease tenant payments. We did lose two tenants at our Fifth Avenue Mall space due to COVID. They had to close, could no longer operate business. So of course that comes along at a time where you're already facing other challenges. Year-to-date expenses are down 21%. We anticipate with seasonality and given the fact that there was some money that we absolutely had to spend the first 2 quarters, we didn't have a choice. I anticipate year-to-date expenses will be down 30% by the end of the year. The biggest challenges we face with expenses is that we own a bunch of 40-year-old parking garages in Anchorage, Alaska. And when things break, they are not, they're simply not cheap to fix. I mean, all of our facilities, our garages at 5th and 6th and 7th are customer/public facing, which means that, when we have a roof failure and water's running down the elevator corridors, there's no other option other than to fix it. So that's the challenge we operate in. We are very cognizant. I do want to give a shout out to the fabulous ACDA Easy Park team. The response, as most departments did right when this pandemic hit, at first it was like, okay, let's take a week to 10 days and get our hands around it. And then when we realized that this was not just going to be a short blip, we made those structural changes. So many thanks again to my team. Year to date, the financial performance of the agency has still been strong, given all things considered. According to our financial statements just reviewed by our board through August 30th, we've lost year to date $33,000, which again is a testament to our ability to respond to cost-cutting measures and simply deferring those expenses that we felt we could. We don't have that luxury moving into 2021, and we will certainly touch on that when we get to our capital budget. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. We own 3 40-year-old garages that are expensive to maintain with the freeze and thaw. We have elevator lobbies that serve both retail, commercial, and tourists that we have to maintain. And not to mention, we have a significant cost every year with security, given the fact that we work and live in an environment downtown, in an urban environment that dictates an additional investment in security. However, we are at least looking at a little bit of a silver lining in the last quarter of 2020. We have been able to do, through the pandemic, we have been able to restructure operations to allow a fairly significant savings in certain areas. So we believe that those savings will come to fruition in the fourth quarter. That will allow us by the end of the year to bump up that overall revenue expense decline up to around 30%. Although the last 5 years have every year has presented challenges. I mean, over the last 5 years, we have been battling an ongoing recession, and then, as you'll remember, the spice epidemic that led into the opioid epidemic, and then we had an earthquake, and now we have a pandemic. By and large, this agency has done an amazing job with the work that we've done the last 5 years, and we really the last year, especially since the pandemic has taken hold, we have really begun aggressively trying to set the table for the next mayor and the next few assemblies. We recognize that there is little or no interest in outside capital in Anchorage at this point in time, but we have taken the approach that now is the opportunity to procure those opportunities for the future. That when the economy comes roaring back, that the city, that ACDA in particular, will have tools like the JCPenney garage and like the Nordstrom building, and like potentially 1 or 2 other pieces of property before we walk out the door, that they will have opportunities, economic opportunities, that once the economy, Anchorage's economy, catches its stride, they'll be able to take advantage of those. In addition, over the last 8 months and looking forward to the next 12 months, we have completed a successful upgrade, roughly $800,000, to upgrade the automatic entry equipment of all of our garages, which not only improves security and revenue management, but gives us a lot of flexibility with regards to special events and actually reduces costs now that we no longer take cash at some of those garages. We're looking at updating the lighting. We have an RFP on the street right now, which will update and modernize the lighting in all 3 garages, which will be paid for by the savings we achieve from those new fixtures. We continue to upgrade security protocols and customer-facing amenities, signage, wayfinding, those kinds of things. So while Anchorage in the state is in kind of this hunker down, stagnant phase, we are continuing to move forward because we recognize that there's a tomorrow, there's a next week, there's going to be a 5 years from now, and it doesn't stop us from beginning to starting to plan and lay the foundation for the future. Other than that, I really don't have anything to add other than we really appreciate and thinking about this is my last time that I'll present a budget to the Assembly. I really want to thank not just this administration, but you as well, because over the years your votes and your support has made a huge difference. And I know it doesn't look like it now, but let me tell you, when we walk out the door in 7 months, there is going to be a heck of a list of accomplishments, including 2 of the first downtown housing developments in the core in 45, 50 years. So we all have a lot to be proud of. I know there's a lot on the table, but we're committed to moving forward. Today is just another day in trying to move the city forward. So on behalf of ACDA and Easy Park and all of our team, that's all I have as far as our operating budget.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. All right, so I have a couple folks in the queue. First, I have Mr. Constant.
So thanks, Andrew. You answered most of my questions. In particular, this is the approved budget for 2020, and you kind of finally went through the kind of the outcome of what the year of COVID did to us. So I have another question that is raised by your comments just now. Are you planning to be done at the end of this term and not seek to stay on, or are you just assuming that that's the way it's going to be?
Through the chair, no, I on my own have always planned to invest 6 years with this mayor and then return to the private sector. So I'm looking at middle of June. I've already talked to my board. I'm prepping my team. We want to be look, I'll be honest with you. When I walked in the door, there was no learning book. I mean, there was no real strategy. There was it was just I showed up on the first day, and we have made way too much progress the last 6 years for that to happen. So I want to make sure that whoever the next mayor is, they know that we are ready, willing, and able. Whoever they might see, a successor, that will have plenty of time to work with them, because Assemblymember Constant, this is going to touch your heart. The key to continuing to improve downtown is consistency, and as we know, over the last 30 years, mayors feel differently about downtown. You have some mayors that love downtown, and you have some mayors that could care less about downtown. What we've tried to do the last 6 years is not just move and change the face of our agency into an agency that's more development oriented and more forward looking, but an agency that consistently sets the table. So we have created expectations among assembly members and stakeholders downtown that whoever walks in the door after I leave, they are going to keep pace. Because for far too long, the city has stagnated because you get 6 years worth of good investment and good energy, and then 6 years of whatever, just whatever. And that doesn't work, because as we know, 30 years is nothing in the life of a downtown. So I fully plan on leaving this position in the middle of June. I'll work that out with the board, but we're excited. And I do personally, I feel like the last 6 years, we've set the table really well. I believe the person who takes my position, who next fills my slot, needs to have a very special set of skills, because I believe we're leaving them the foundation to really create just an amazing next 50 years in downtown Anchorage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Halcrow, I appreciate your words and the planning that you've done to weather these challenges. Have there been any federal, state, or other opportunities that you've been able to take advantage of, or to try to offset some of these revenue losses, either through any kind of COVID relief funds?
Through the chair, no. We are not eligible for CARES funding, from what I've been told. State funding and federal funding are not available to municipal sub-agencies. So really, the containment of the pandemic effects on our income and expenses has been an internal process. I mean, we have had no outside help. Which, look, that's the way we live. I mean, we are quasi-independent, and while I come to you every year for kind of an approval of my budget, the next 12 months, it's really up to us to make this place work. And we're fortunate we have an amazing team, and I have an amazing board. So, but no, we haven't been allowed any relief for revenue loss or anything else.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any further discussion. Thanks.
I think one more slide. I think Andrew touched on his capital program. So I think Andrew in 2021, his team is going to be, they're still going to be doing a little bit of investment on the people mover relocation from downtown. He talked about the aging and structural improvements and requirements needed on the garages, and then the security and the IT upgrades that they're proposing in 2021. So just recognize that ACVA does have a separate capital program, and I think Mr. Halpro talked about all of those to some detail. So anyway, I don't have anything to add. Just recognize that they do have a small capital program next year.
Thanks. I don't have anyone in the queue. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right, Mr. Chairman, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the health department, and I need to switch slides for a minute. If you just give me a moment to get the health department back up, and just give us a moment, and we'll start off with the health department. All right. So this is the last department that we're going to review from general government, utilities, and operating through these next couple of days here. So what we're going to start off with is the health department's regular operating budget, similar to the library, parks, and treasury. We have a separate slide as it relates to the proposal for the positions related to alcohol, but let's start with their regular operating budget. So, so the health department has the changes that we're proposing here on the for the direct service department. Obviously, we're making a little bit of changes in their operating, on their fuel and their positions. I think we had a one-time contribution for a workman's comp settlement for a little bit of money. So that was a 1Q adjustment that we had, so that will not be there next year. We also moved some money from M&O, and we provided it to the health department for some work that they needed to get covered out at the Chugiak Eagle River Senior Center. So just truing that up, and so that those dollars would not be there available as we progress into 21. So we made those adjustments, and then we get down to the salaries and the changes. I think for many departments, but for the health department particularly, they have contractual obligations to their contractor that helps them with animal care and control. So there is a contractual obligation increase for that service. And then in this slide, the cemetery maintenance and contractual increase is $15,000. Obviously, if the budget is approved to move the cemetery from the health department to Parks and Recreation, we'll move those dollars back to parks, but since it still rests within health, that's why we reflect it here. This next one here is the homeless sheltering contractual services with Brother Francis for an annual services. Obviously, the dollar amount for this, I think on an annual basis, is roughly $400,000. There was some conversations at the administration about the changes in the types of services that were being talked about at the time we put this proposal together. If there is the amount of service being provided and the cost related to those services continues to be or is more than the $200,000 in here, then that is something that we would either get clarification as part of the S version or clarification as we look at the entire year of services and costs in the Brother Francis shelter for next year. I think some of the highlight of that is in the past that 400,000 was providing service to over 130, maybe 150 individuals. And then just due to COVID and the need to provide physical spacing and then meeting some of the higher demand needs at Brother Francis, we're working to get some clarification on exactly what that cost would be on an annual basis next year. But we started off with a $200,000 for contractual there as proposed. And then you'll see the transition where we reduce the health department's budget by $500,000, which is the cemetery, and we'll put that to parks with the position that is included there. And then some salaries and non-represent scale adjustments. So again, this does not include the alcohol tax, which would be on the next slide. But and these dollars, these are the tax-supported dollars that support the health department. You will not see on this slide those grant-supported activities that the health department receives from the state, primarily a little bit from the feds. Programs from like their public health nursing or child care licensing, air quality, some of those things, HIV prevention, WIC program, where they get some state assistance for that. That's not reflective in this $13 million. Those dollars are in addition to that, but they are reflected in your budget, in the budget book. They are at the end of the health department, similar to the other departments that have a similar situation, primarily transit and a little bit of APD. But this is their direct operating budget for services that are reported, or services provided with tax dollars that are not alcohol. So if Ms. Harris or Ms. Fetko want to add to anything to this, I will let them jump in, and then we'll open it to questions to the assembly. Ms. Harris, Ms. Fetko, do you have something you wanted to add?
Not at this time. Thank you for the great overview, but we are here for questions.
Okay.
Thank you. I have a couple folks in the queue. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two questions. If memory serves, I thought cemetery was moving over to Parks and Rec. So I just need reminding on that one. And then on the homeless sheltering, my recollection of Brother Francis sheltering dollars that we had paid were always one-time gap funding based on particular circumstances. I was unaware of any annual funding year over year. And in fact, our annual sheltering dollars had started out about a year ago to be cold weather, winter sheltering. We expanded those last year into year round, but this seems like something completely new to me. So I would need some more context or information about where that came from, please.
Okay, I will do the first one first. You are correct. The cemetery is going from health to Parks and Rec. If I didn't say that, my apologies. And then the second part is, Ms. Zolotel, I think you are on the same track, and that is originally the Brother Francis was getting state support, and I think it was in 2019. They were receiving state support, and that so we funded them for like $200,000. The state was funding them for $200,000. The state didn't provide it for them. We provided an emergency appropriation so that they could stay open in the winter time, I think through the second half of the year. And this is a similar situation that we had barely back in 19, which is, for lack of a better term from my understanding is this is sort of the base amount that we had provided. The other half of support for annual contracting was coming from the state or other nonprofits. But if I am mistaken, I am going to ask the health department to jump in, or if Mr. Bockenstead isn't still listening in, he can weigh in. But I believe that is my recollection. And if it's not, and those are not available, I will get your answer for you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a cemetery question? I'm sorry. I'm
sure,
not under. Thanks. Mr. Wilbur, wouldn't that then be moving those dollars then over to Parks and Rec on the cemetery maintenance contractual increase instead of having them here?
Yes, I mentioned that. So, but for the proposed budget, they, the cemetery still remains in the health department. And I mentioned that if that move actually happens and the assembly approves that, we're going to move this $15,000 to Parks and Rec. It will not go to the health department. If I wasn't clear, my apologies.
No problem. Thank you for closing the loop on that for me.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. So I had a similar question on the funding for Brother Francis. So this is not an increase above the 400,000 that was last year. This is just 200,000, right? We're not doing 600,000 to Brother Francis, are we?
You are correct. We are not.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I don't see anyone else in the queue. Thanks.
All right. The next slide is illustration of the proposal for the health department as it relates to where the alcohol tax allocation might be located. I think I mentioned last time that while we have identified the health department as the location for the Pay for Success, currently the Pay for Success program rests with the CFO, and it's basically managing the dollars that are coming in and then clearing the performance based on the criteria for those providers for that Pay for Success program. We're going to be talking at an administrative level whether that stays in the health department or whether that moves or stays in the CFOs. And then obviously if whether or not it's paid for with alcohol tax or not, we're still going to be looking at which department it makes more sense based on some comments that we've received. And then the idea was that the purpose of the program is in relation to topics for homelessness, mental health. And so the Pay for Success was identified as an opportunity for the alcohol tax, but I think we'll be talking about that a little bit more. Excuse me. And then obviously we have the administration's proposed some positions that are inside the health department that would be supporting efforts related to homelessness or managing of grants related to maybe some nonprofits that might be supportive or shoring up homelessness or mental health. The categories that we've got them in here, this was our best estimate that we put as it relates here. Operations coordinator, once the treatment center gets on board, we're going to need an individual to help provide that coordination to the treatment center and the other related activities. And so that was why that piece is in there. We're going to need some support staff to manage that. Some questions about the epidemiologist and the benefits to that. I think I'm going to leave that one to the health department. And then obviously we've talked about the need for some additional nursing support and how that might benefit those programs or those individuals that might be facing challenges with mental health or substance abuse, and how those positions could assist in that role. And then obviously we put a little money into the shelters, the overnight shelter, that 360,000. That would be above or in addition to the continuation of the 735,000 that's currently in the health department's budget. This would be in addition to that for overnight shelters for year-round support. And then a proposed amount that would go out for to grants for early education and evidence-based grants providers. We put those in the health department as a place to sort of be the clearinghouse or the coordination for those programs as a proposal. And then a little bit at the bottom for what a program that was supported with grant money that's not going to be there next year. So since it wasn't part of the operating budget with tax money, it's proposed that we shore that up and keep that program whole with the 44,000. And then last piece is some operational costs for shelters, day center services and treatment. And this doesn't fully reflect where the partnerships would be coming in and the amount of match that would be available to shore those things up. But from sort of at a high level view for the health department, this is where the proposals for those additional alcohol tax revenues would go. So I think that is, again, I know we're going to get into this a little bit deeper. I think I saw a work session scheduled next Friday at 2 or 3. We'll be talking about the alcohol tax. I assume it will be related to this, but as it relates to the budget right now, again, Ms. Harris or Ms. Fetco, if there's something you want to point out now, or Mr. Chairman, if you want to wait until we get into a separate conversation to talk about the alcohol tax holistically or individually, I'll yield to your direction.
Thanks. We'll go ahead and go through the queue and then answer what we can at this point. So start with Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So I just am really kind of in shock right now with this proposal. I think I spent 40 hours in meetings with various entities and hearing over and over again what the priorities are. And I don't see it all reflected in here, the mental health first aid or any part of the core team. And I see now a whole bevy of nurses, and I can't quite plug together the connection between all of that work that we did to this proposal here. So I am very much looking forward to our more in-depth conversation. And I just feel like I'm waking up from a dream that I had all of this work that we did before, but it wasn't a thing, because here we are with this proposal before us that doesn't reflect at all the work we did. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, I look forward to the work session. I guess I'm a little bit of feedback. I'll just state, as I'm trying to put the pieces of the operating and the alcohol tax budgets together, is that if there's sheltering dollars, and if that's a direct grant potentially to Brother Francis, I guess I would like to see that under the alcohol tax and all the sheltering kept together, except for where it would be revenue replacement, where we already have the $700,000 in the operating budget, and maybe that $200,000 could pick up one of these other positions or something that seems a bit more tangentially or less directly attached to the alcohol tax. And I hope that, yes, when we move into the work session, we can kind of have the buckets of alcohol tax dedications attached to the various positions so that there's a bit more of a direct line drawn, because I'm a little bit with Mr. Constant, uncertain on how this reflects kind of the community conversations we've had. And I'm a little bit curious, and this is just a question so that you can be prepared for the next work session, about the pay for success ending up here. I guess that wasn't my impression when we authorized that program. So I'll just need a little bit more fleshing out of that in particular as well. Thanks.
Thanks. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I echo a lot of what Ms. Zolotel and Mr. Constant said. I might frame it a little bit differently and just say that I think that, well, first of all, I think that this is sort of a preliminary proposal, and we've all read Appendix R. I don't think that what ends up being passed through the process we go through with the administration and the assembly, I don't think it's going to look like this in a variety of ways. But some of these things, like the epidemiologist, for example, are very clearly CARES Act related. And I know there's a hesitation on the administration's part to do things with CARES Act money that's been converted because it's one-time money and it's 1 year money. But I think we should seriously consider that rather than try to shoehorn in things that I don't feel fit tightly into the initiative that the voters passed for the alcohol tax. The alcohol tax was passed by the voters with a certain understanding of what kind of things would be funded. And I don't believe that a number of these things dovetail with that. But they do dovetail very tightly with the purpose of the CARES Act and responding to the pandemic and strengthening us for the pandemic. And again, I understand that the administration is hesitant to do that because CARES Act is one-time money. But I think that the loss of trust with the voters, I think, outweighs the potential challenge we'd be creating for ourselves when we're developing the 2022 budget. That is to say, if the CARES Act money is gone and we've got to figure out how to put these things into a more permanent footing, we will work and figure out a way in 2022. But right now, I think this needs major revision. And yeah, I look forward to that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any further discussion. Thank you.
Right. Okay, so Mr. Chairman, that is all of the review of the departments. We will look forward to a follow-up on this particular topic on the alcohol tax next week. I want to thank you for all of your time last week and this week. And again, if you have questions, please send them to us. We'll work very closely with Desiree. The questions that we received today, we'll regroup as a team here, and then we will summarize those, work with Desiree to make sure that we got them all. Again, we'll get the responses from last week's presentation or questions to you either this afternoon or early next week. And then look forward to the first public hearing next Tuesday night, and then the following Wednesday, on the 4th, will be the second public hearing with, the Assembly of proposed amendments, and we'll be working with the incoming acting mayor on any S versions that we might propose at the administration on changes, including changes to the alcohol tax. I think there's some flexibility on the administration side to make some changes. We recognize that we've heard from the Assembly members, so we anticipate making some adjustments there. And then the amendments for the Assembly, if they are coming in and if the Assembly office can work with us after the second public hearing on proposed amendments, we might be able to figure out how we might be able to incorporate those as well. And then you have a work session scheduled for the 13th to work through your proposed amendments. At least I think that's where you are right now. And then final action on the 17th of November. And again, we'll look forward to working with you in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we put this 2021 proposed budget to approval. So again, Mr. Chairman and members of the Assembly, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Wilbur, for the presentation and for all of the directors for attending. So before I close this work session, want to do a little logistics for the next work session. Mr. Schutte, are you with us?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I am.
Great, fantastic. So as we discussed earlier, would you still like a little bit of time before we move on to the next work session?
Mr. Chairman, let me make sure that at least Jack Kademus can join me. And if so, we'd be happy to start at 2:30.
Okay, great. Then I'll go ahead and see everyone at 2:30. Thanks. So I'm going to go ahead and close this work session.